So let's jump into the League of Nations, because that's our primary institution, the cornerstone of the interwar world, the League and the League system. So first of all, since this is somewhat related to territorial changes, the League introduced the mandate system, where former German colonies, former basically territories of the Central Powers, were put under the authority of various League members, primarily France and Britain, to basically be governed fairly until they can be independent. So these custodians were supposed to help these countries on the road to independence. And first of all, we have the Category A mandate for countries which are pretty much almost ready for independence, and this, for the most part, were countries which were part of the Ottoman Empire during World War I. So, for example, Syria. Then we had countries which were not deemed to be ready, and that a significant time, decades of tutelage, would be required to bring them up into a position where they could be independent, and that was pretty much applied to most of Africa. So former German colonies like Cameroon and Togoland. And then Category C mandates were basically places which were deemed to, well, basically not ever be fit for independence. And this was primarily just like random islands in the Pacific, like Palau, which today is an independent nation. And an exception to that is Southwest Africa, modern-day Namibia, which is a significant territory. As I said, it was given to South Africa. And the League was basically made up of three major components. We have the Council, the Assembly, and the Secretariat. The Secretariat is basically just the League's bureaucratic component. So we have like the National Court of Justice and all the random League bureaucrats and researchers that were needed to run things. The health organization, I don't remember what exactly its name was. All that stuff is in the Secretariat. Then we have the Assembly. The Assembly is basically all the members of the League of Nations. And they, due to its size, they can only meet very rarely, and one of the most important things they do is that they select the temporary members for the Council. And the Council works as kind of the executive branch of the League of Nations. It includes 4 permanent members, the UK, France, Italy, and Japan, and once Germany joins the League of Nations, also Germany, and 6 temporary members, which are selected by the Assembly, as we said. And 2 things to remember. First of all, the Council can meet on short notice to respond to crises. On average, they would meet like 5 times per year. And there's also the rule of unanimity. All decisions undertaken by the Council must be unanimous. The Council also has 3 significant powers to help deal with any issues. It can issue a moral condemnation, it can establish a commission of inquiry, and it can levy economic sanctions. So what are these capabilities? Moral condemnation, they condemn someone for doing something. So like, no, Yugoslavia, stop setting Estonian babies on fire. Commission of inquiry, they get a commission, they send it to inquire, figure out what the hell is going on so that the League can respond. So, I don't know, they send people to Estonia to make sure that babies are indeed being set on fire by the Yugoslavians. And what are the circumstances, what are the details of this case? And then finally, economic sanctions. So, if nothing is done, the League can bring about economic sanctions, although this was only done once in the entire history of the League, and very haphazardly, in the case of Abyssinia. And you won't stop setting babies on fire? Fine, we will stop all exports of lighters into Yugoslavia. And of course, it's important to consider that the League was significantly weakened by the absence of 3 states, which were major players in the world: the United States, the Soviet Union, and Germany. Germany joined in 1926. The Soviets joined very late in 1934. Already after the Germans and the Japanese had left, and the League had already pretty much lost much of its relevance, and the Americans never joined. Another term which is important to consider And remember, for the League is the Covenant. The Covenant is basically the constitution of the League of Nations. And we also have another organization, which is pretty cool, let's say. That organization is the Conference of Ambassadors, and this is a dualistic institution. It's a double-edged sword for the League of Nations. The Conference of Ambassadors includes ambassadors from the 5 great power victors of World War I, including the United States, unlike the League of Nations, although in this case the U.S. ambassador officially is an observer and not an equal of the 4 states, but as a representative of the United States he still wields considerable influence. And this conference helped resolve a lot of crises. But the question we have to ask ourselves is whether this was, good for the League or bad for the League, because on one hand, you had a capable organization which was capable of helping bring about this mediation and peacekeeping which the League sought and tried to achieve. But on the other hand, you have this institution which is much more traditional than the League, going around and doing its own thing, meddling in what should be the League's business and undermining its authority, mediating instead of the League, and sometimes even undermining the League by making a decision which goes against what the League had agreed upon. And of course, one more term which I didn't mention on the slide, but is important to remember, is the idea of collective security, which the League was supposed to bring about. And does anybody feel like they can explain this term? Any volunteers? All right. Oh, we have one person. Just maintaining world peace. Well, of course, that's the aim of it, but that's not the nature. Pretty much every system has claimed that it tries to maintain world peace, right? Currently we don't have effectively collective security, but although the League of the United Nations has tried to achieve it, it doesn't actually exist in practice. But every system kind of claimed to this. Even the balance of power system of pre-World War I Europe, and then that was also, they also claimed that it was trying to maintain peace, and it managed to do so for pretty much 100 years. All right, we have some people typing. Trying to defend the existing balance between countries so they don't go to war? And no. That is actually the complete opposite of the idea of self-determination. Alright, so let me explain. In traditional alliance system, countries, have these alliances, these secret agreements. Yes, you're right, I apologize. But let me explain the whole thing. So in a traditional alliance system, a bunch of countries band together for a specific objective, right? They have a specific national interest that they want to defend, a specific convergence of their interests, a specific agreement. Part of it may be secret. But the League tried to get rid of these traditional alliances to supersede them. The idea was that there would be no alliances, but rather a system where every country would be protected by every country, where regardless of national interest, all countries would intervene if the status quo was violated, with the logic being that, if this was the case, then, nobody would be powerful enough to change the world, and that would keep everybody safe. And so unlike a traditional alliance, it was global, and it ignored interests, and it wasn't limited in its scope. As a matter of fact, it was expected that regular alliances would become obsolete and basically be removed. And indeed, that if we have one aggressor, everybody moved to counter them. And of course, minor states were especially big fans of this, like for example Belgium, because they weren't forced to work as part of and they didn't have to, try to please any great power because they would be protected. But in practice, this system didn't really work. We still had great powers basically doing their own thing, as we'll see later. Like for example, with Italy violating the rights of other states, or the Munich Conference later on for Germany's violation. Various cases of aggression where the League failed to really do anything because this was not really in the interest of the great powers because it limited their power and their ability, and they would have to levy resources to do things which were not in their own interest. So despite a lot of enthusiasm from the global public, this system never really reached a level of credibility where it could actually be trusted. And over time, it would be shown that, and actually you have traditional alliances. One thing to remember is NATO. Well, this is during the Cold War, but NATO sells itself as collective security. But the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is not actually an example of collective security because it's a traditional alliance system. It's not global. NATO isn't going to do anything if Uzbekistan is screwed over, unless the members of NATO agree that it's in their interest to do something. It has a limited goal and is bound by national interest and values to some extent. It was called collective security largely as a way that, largely so that the American government could sell it to the American people in a more palatable way than traditional alliance. So that's important to remember. The League is trying to bring about collective security, but doesn't really work out very well. On the right, you guys can see a number of key dates where a number of countries left and joined. Ethiopia was added in 1923, the only independent African country. Germany in 1926 was finally allowed to join after the Versailles previously prohibited it from doing so. Then Japan leaves in 1933 following the Mukin crisis and the fallout of Manchuria. Germany left in September 1933, pretty much as soon as Hitler established himself in power, he left. Then after that, the Soviets joined, Italy leaves after Abyssinia in 1937, and then in the end of 1939, the Soviets are kicked out because of their, aggression in Eastern Europe. Alright, any questions about League system? Or actually, let's wait with that, because first let's cover how effective was the League at its mission of peacekeeping. So, the early League saw a number of successes and a number of failures. And first, let's take a look at some of the successes. For example, the Åland Islands. The Åland Islands are basically a bunch of islands where barely anybody lives, which are straight in the middle between Sweden and Finland, in the middle of the Baltic. Both countries believe that the islands were there. The League comes in, the League decides that they should belong to Finland, and both sides accept this, and they continue. And this decision is enforced to this very day. The Åland Islands, their status has never been challenged again, and they are part of Finland still today. Then we have Upper Silesia. In 1921, a plebiscite is held where the people will vote. Do they want to be part of Germany or Poland? 700,000 vote to be in Germany, 500,000 to be in Poland. But the significant Polish population is very unhappy. There's rioting and upheaval. So the League decides to split the territory, and both sides accept the decision because they agree with it. Then in 1925, we have the case of Bulgaria. The Bulgarians, on the Bulgarian-Greek border, like 2 or 3 Greek soldiers get shot, and in response, the Greeks sent a small invasion force to occupy one Bulgarian town. The League of Nations gets involved, it mediates a ceasefire, and after this, both sides basically, yeah, accept this, and the new ceasefire is quickly enforced. The Greeks leave the country. The Bulgarians, I believe, pay some minor reparations. Um, but there are also some significant League failures. So, for example, Vilnius, or Vilno, as it's known in Polish. So Vilnius was the historic capital of Lithuania, but the population there was primarily Polish. I think over two-thirds of the people there were ethnically Polish. But since this was, a major city, it would be the biggest in Lithuania and would be integral for the functioning of Lithuania, the League decides that it should, stay in Lithuania. But the Polish are not happy with this. They have this elaborate scheme where this guy, who's officially a rebel and working without government permission, but is actually being funded and supported by the Polish government, leads a small force of rebels to take over the city, and they set up their own country for 2 or 3 years, which only Poland recognizes, with its own passports and everything, and a border checkpoint, and in 2 or 3 years, Poland annexes the country because that's what the people want. So, not only did Poland ignore the League of Nations, it's also important that the League wasn't able to do anything against Poland, and second of all, that the Conference of Ambassadors, that outside organization, overruled the League and made a decision in favor of Poland later. And then another important crisis is the Corfu crisis in 1923, another significant failure for the League. So the Albanians and the Greeks were disputing this random island in the Mediterranean, and there was an Italian official there, and along his side, his staff, he was killed on the island. So in response, Mussolini sends a bunch of ships to bombard the island, to punish the Greeks for the murder of the official, despite the fact that, there's no evidence that the Greek government was involved. As a matter of fact, it was unlikely. It was probably just like, some random bandits or some random radical political activists. And a few dozen Greeks are killed during the bombardment. The Italians refused to work with the League of Nations, and eventually the Conference of Ambassadors gets involved, and which of course involves Italy, because they have one of the ambassadors there, and they also have a member on the Council of the League of Nations. And basically, the conference makes a decision that's generally pro-Italian, doesn't punish the Italians for bombarding the island and killing a few dozen Greeks. It forces the Greeks to pay reparations and for ceremonial apology to be made to the Italians. So, looking at all these cases, what are some conclusions that we can make about how the League's early attempts at peacekeeping were functioning? And does anybody have any conclusions? Yes. And Cyclo says it works if the country being ordered is willing to accept it. And that's true. In all the 3 successes, the Åland Islands, Upper Silesia, Bulgaria, both participants were very happy to work with the League. But any other conclusions that we can draw? Does anybody have any ideas? You guys can speak too instead of typing. As a matter of fact, it's better because it's more efficient. No conclusions? Oh, we've got one person typing. So we'll give them a second. In the meantime, you can think about your own conclusions. One person is typing. So we'll just wait for a second. Sorry for the slowdown. Alright, I think they wanted to make peace with other countries because they were afraid of what they could do. A good example is Italy. I'm sorry, I'm not really sure what your point here is, but we can definitely see that with these big powers, the League is unable to do much. It's not really capable of dealing with major powers like Italy, or even, medium powers like Poland, which, wasn't at the level of the great powers, but was, the biggest of the successor states, probably, the largest one, alongside Yugoslavia. And we also see that, we have, especially if we've got people from the country that's trying to violate the peace, as a part of the council. Alright, but so this inability to deal with great powers, that's also important to consider. And so the League worked sometimes, but rarely when great powers were involved. And then we also need to remember the Conference of Ambassadors. We can see the Conference of Ambassadors meddling in both cases of failure and undermining the League's authority. And then the fact that the League depended a lot on goodwill. Right? Because that's the logical extension of, them expecting both sides to basically agree with and accept their decisions. So, the League worked sometimes, but not always, and over time it will work less and less as goodwill continues to evaporate and militarism rises in the world and in Europe. Any questions on peacekeeping in the League of Nations? Because with this we are finishing this section.